Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brian actually isn't here today. He's on an airplane. He's flying back from a KubeCon in Berlin, so hopefully we'll have him on the next show to talk a little bit about what's been going on over there in Berlin. If you've been watching it this week, certainly a lot of really good content and a lot of good information coming out of there this week. But we have a super interesting guest today in the fact that, we tend to have a lot of, what I would say startups and vendors and a lot of people that are in the industry, but tend to have products, if you will, that they want to talk about. We're kind of flipping that on its head today. The kind of the unicorns that have always been for us has been customers and real world practitioners. And so with that, I wanted to introduce Matthew Beckman to the podcast, owner of, just say it, is it Dryas.io?
Dryas, yeah.
Yes, Dryas.io. Yep. And ex-VP of DevOps at Craftsy. So,
hi, everybody.
So I wanted to real quick go into this and say, we first met, AWS reInvent a few years ago, if I remember right, while you were still at Craftsy.
Yeah.
And I was really fascinated by your journey and where you are now. And you were doing DevOps before it was cool. and so tell everyone a little bit about your history and kind of your run up to opening your own consulting business.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And first of all, just thanks for having me. I'm excited to be part of this with you guys. So I've been really a practitioner with a pretty traditional Unix and network administration background for about 18 years. And, most of that time, pretty much all of that time has been working with small companies or startups that had a software development, practice is sort of the mover. So we were building products for the market. When you say I was doing DevOps for it was cool. Back then I just called it being friends with the developers. And somehow I kind of lucked into really good relationships. And maybe I was, I'll take a little bit of credit being good at building relationships with developers way back then and just trying to learn from them. And look at things like the way they deployed code is sort of a pattern to deploy infrastructure. So it's something that I've been really fascinated in for a long time, and tried to help my teams, get over the traditional sort of silos of ops and dev. So again, that history sort of spans a handful of different startups that almost no one has heard of. Those all went the way of not the unicorn. But most recently, and where we met, I was at Craftsy, and Craftsy was this fascinating, very high growth, pretty successful story of a company that started out trying to change the way online education worked. Way back in 2006, not 2006, 2010. Online education was terrible. You'd try to take a class, and it was basically a video camera in the back of a lecture hall. And so the founders at Craftsy tried to turn that on its head and create sort of an interactive learning experience where students could ask other students questions. They could interact with the instructor and get direct feedback in a way that just didn't exist. So they built this really cool product and tried to sell it to universities for sort of an academic setting, and discovered that the universities were really excited about the idea, but their planning cycles were just going to extend well past the runway that we had as a sort of bootstrapped startup. So they pivoted along the way. They had been producing courses to sort of illustrate the way the platform worked, and then this quilting course that was selling like hotcakes. And so they just pivoted the business and started focusing on creating educational content for knitters and sewers and cake decorators and people who are passionate about their hobbies. And that really led to unlocking something big for the business. My role there, we had despite sort of being, usually people don't associate quilting with high technology choices. But despite that,
fair enough,
we had a real focus to try and build, a technology stack and a practice that was very forward looking, and it was amazing. One of the great things, as many people know about startups, is you get to start from scratch. You get to make every choice new. There's no legacy that you have to carry forward. And so when I joined the team full time about 6 years ago, we adopted a cloud first strategy. So we were deeply AWS, really for all elements of the technology stack. Actually, for the first 2 years, the only facilities we had was wireless networking, and then our router for our uplink. Everything was either SaaS or cloud. And similarly, along with that, to adopt, and not even to adopt it, but just to build DevOps into all of the ways that we handled continuous deployment, continuous delivery, our relationship with developers, the way we managed on call. And it was awesome. The business doubled many different meaningful metrics about every year. And I think when I first met you was about the second year at reInvent, and I had just come out of 18 months of doubling infrastructure capacity on a 6-month run, which sounds really exciting, and it was, but it's also a little tiring. It's tough to keep up when
sure, that's a heck of a sprint,
like
right?
that. It's a heck of a sprint. It's really great to. I get fond of saying it's a great problem to have, and it's still a problem.
Yeah, fair enough.
So that sort of gets me through through Craftsy, and I guess the last part of that story and what I'm doing now is, after honestly 6 years of that, I decided I wanted to do something different. And so I've kind of kicked off this consulting gig that we can talk a little bit about. But, really the story for me has been, like you said, kind of DevOps before anybody called it that, and an awful lot of cloud for the last 6 or 7 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I have a ton of questions around the hyper growth startup areas and AWS probably growing and ramping into their full portfolio all at the same time. But I'll save some of those questions for another day. But I did want to ask you, what was it like? Because everyone thinks about the AWS and the full portfolio now, and a lot of the CI/CD tools and all these other things they have now, but they didn't have that back then. And so what was it like? Like you bootstrapping your own tools, and then how compare and contrast that to where Amazon eventually kind of met you or wanted to meet you, if I use that?
Yeah, no, it's a super good question, Aaron, and it's insightful. When we were making these choices in 2010 and 2011, AWS was nowhere near maturity in any way you want to define that. There were more outages, more interruptions. They were not transparent about the way the systems worked and the metrics, particularly when you get up to some of the limits that exist within their ecosystem. Those things didn't exist. EBS was so immature you couldn't even guarantee throughput to a volume. So you really did a lot. We did a lot of sort of engineering in the dark and guesswork at the way the underlying infrastructure was actually working, which you can do, but it's tough, and it's tough to feel warm and fuzzy when you go to bed at night that everything's going to work the way you expect. We had some headwinds, just sort of in I'll say the community, and particularly with our investors who were a little dubious. At some point along the way, we did get some angel and venture rounds to help fund that growth. But there was definitely a perspective that these things aren't ready. That perspective wasn't wrong. There were definitely some sort of dark alleys that would bite you. It has been fascinating to watch that sort of grow. I can think of different inflection points in Amazon's maturity, probably less in the volume of products they offer, although that was meaningful. But just as they dialed in sort of clear thresholds and metrics that teams could engineer to. And I mentioned the EBS one because that was big for us. We would continually be, we would see performance problems in our application because EBS throughput just went to the floor. And why did that happen? And we didn't expect that would happen. So as a great example, when they released PIOps, that was the provisioned IOPS on that storage platform. That was huge for us because now we had a target we could engineer to. But beyond that, I think a big gap from then to now is really in the kind of the ways that you can do continuous deployment in things like immutable infrastructure. One of the last projects, well, actually really the last project that I worked on at Craftsy was we did a full rewrite, like the last 12, 15 months that I was there, and moved from sort of a Java monolith to a service-oriented service-oriented architecture with a lot of CD in it. And the CD that we do now, and that a lot of people do now, where you're deploying 6, 7, 8 times a day, however many times you want, really just wasn't, might have been practical at some extremely high level of effort back then, but certainly isn't now. So it's been really interesting. And in those early days, you basically followed Netflix to understand what AWS was going to do next. That was a whole other dynamic that was really fascinating to watch. Is just the way that Netflix and Amazon, I don't know if I want to say influenced each other or worked together, but certainly there was some roadmap, I think, that was built for Netflix that really benefited the community at large. So if I compare those early days with now, it's staggering. And I can be a little bit of a fanboy for AWS. I built a business in their ecosystem for 6 years that had the growth characteristics that I described, and it was wonderful. I really don't have many bad things to say about them. That isn't to say that there aren't many good public cloud options today. There certainly are. But when you look at the stack that AWS has and just the volume of products that are all pretty mature, I don't know if I want to say it's easier. It probably is in a lot of ways, but there's sort of an anti-pattern in there that it's just understanding all of the things that you can do in making those choices it's almost overwhelming, relative to certainly what it was 6 years ago.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to talk about kind of your operations for a second as well, what would you say? So you mentioned earlier kind of relationships with the developers was certainly key, and kind of DevOps before it was this concept of DevOps. But what would you say were your keys to success that both you helped and is probably transferable into you helping others?
That's a really good question, because it's going to make me kind of be thoughtful about that. I think that it's almost a cliche now, but it hasn't been a cliche if you go back in time that long. And that's just sort of being blameless, adopting a culture of blamelessness, doing blameless postmortems after incidents. This was probably, I'll say, the fundamental thing that, if I was going to say the 4 or 5 cultural tenets that we adopted as an engineering team, first and foremost, nobody's alone in this. If somebody's struggling, we're all going to help it. We just didn't create, tolerate, or allow any sort of siloing of responsibility, so that if there was a problem, somebody kind of said, it's not my problem, I'm not going to deal with it. We all jumped in to help when something was going on. And then the second part of that I mentioned is the blamelessness. When you're growing like that, and when you're building tools in a sort of nascent ecosystem, Amazon would probably take issue with me saying they were nascent in 2010, but one that's immature, like you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know is always going to bite you, and that's just true. And getting to a mindset and helping people be focused on that as a reality, and not sort of fall into a very basic human pattern of saying, well, so and so did this, and now that this is causing us problems, darn that so and so. That was huge. I could share any number of the kind of stories that you would expect that I'd have as an engineering, leader for our engineering team. Incredibly long firefights, outages that lasted, hours and days, decisions that seemed great at the time that 6 months later were falling apart. All kinds of stresses on a team. And we did a great job of hiring, smart people and giving them tools to succeed. But I think the biggest thing that we did was just keeping everybody focused on it. It's not somebody's fault. We have something we have to work on here. Let's make it better. And that's the end of the conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And as a practitioner, how much do you follow the DevOps community, and are there certain people or trends that you follow, and what's been kind of interesting to you these days?
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about too, just because as a practitioner, you really have to work hard to carve off time to follow the community, to listen to a podcast, to read a blog. There's not really a part of a company whose primary goal is to teach people how to make quilts that you could say, well, 20% of my time is conferences. So that was a thing that I always kind of wished I did more, but definitely there's some trends that I've been pretty passionate about. And I talked about blamelessness. Dave Zweibeck, and Dave, if I just murdered your last name, I'm sorry, wrote a great book, Beyond Blame, Learning from Failure and Success. I love him just because I don't love him, but I love his ideas and what he talks about around, just getting past blame in teams and postmortems and sort of everything. J. Paul Reed, I think is a guy who's done some really interesting work in DevOps and then incident management. So sidebar, one of the projects I'm working on now is with VictorOps, which is a incident management platform. It basically does real-time handling of events and then manages, who's on call, what the schedule is, and escalations, and that kind of stuff. And so incident management and how that has changed as sort of a function of DevOps adoption has been an area that I'm really interested in. And J. Paul Reed's done some really cool stuff there to help people think about, incident management as a life cycle and really sort of picking apart, what has either been really poorly understood by devs or has been just sort of ITSM and maybe unattractive to devs, making that approachable in a more DevOpsy fashion.
And by the way, folks, too, for those listening, we'll put links in the show notes to some of the folks and like the book and everything. So we'll get those added in. So just so everyone knows that you don't have to remember or rewind right now.
Yeah, good. But other stuff, outside of sort of specific people, that I'm super interested in right now, and you kind of talked about this earlier, but Kubernetes, Mesos, Docker, those systems, and then serverless. I think that the first pile of stuff that I mentioned there really is sort of an interesting parallel to AWS. Just all of those Kubernetes, Mesos, and Docker have reached, I think, a maturity now that is going to really enable people to both build interesting things and to unlock, maybe step functions in the way that we're able to do application development and infrastructure. I have at various times been skeptical of all of those different approaches for sort of managing workloads and applications, but it's exciting to see how mature they are now and what people are starting to do. So that's really interesting. And then the serverless stack, we did some very early stuff with Lambda at Craftsy and AWS, and I mentioned that rewrite we did. Coming out of that, we adopted a lot more of it. And I don't know, we might be talking, I think we're going to be talking about serverless and things like Lambda, in the kind of odd ways in 5 years that we talk about the cloud today. It's just going to skip all of that kind of ugly configuration and change management stuff that ops has to do. I'm super interested to see where that stuff goes. Yeah.
And that brings up it's a little bit of lessons learned on the fly there with that rewrite, but I'll ask you this, looking back, because, everyone has this idea of, okay, if I had to do it all over again, what would I have done differently? Or, what would you have done differently is maybe one question. And then maybe I'll follow up with, what would you do the same? But let's start with differently.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think the thing I would have done differently is and this would have been almost impossible. So it's great to be able to just, muse on this, but I would have carved out more time to write and speak and to share the work that we were doing. I probably was speaking at one or two conferences a year throughout that time at Craftsy, and particularly early. We really were uncovering things that weren't commonly known. You couldn't find this stuff on an AWS forum. And I wish I had been better, both personally and then as a leader to the rest of the team at creating a culture of giving back, either through blogging or speaking, at conferences, things like that. That was it was hard, and I wish I would have done more of that. but in terms of what I would have done the same, it's most of, I don't want us to sound arrogant, but I think that I would have kept most of the choices that we made from tooling, most of the sort of strategic technology decisions that we made, really proved out. I mentioned we had a lot of sort of doubters and maybe headwinds to sort of fight through where we started. I would frequently say early that my goal was to have a facilities-less business, and we weren't able to finish there. Ultimately, we had to do some stuff with on-prem, but building a business in the cloud is actually sort of an expected norm today, and we were able to do it 6 years ago. It was great, and I think we did all of it pretty well, I guess.
And that's great to hear. And
yeah,
what would be,
in fairness, lots of stuff blew out, but
I think in the balance,
of course, choices. Yeah.
What was, so when you say you tried to do everything with kind of a cloud first mentality, in the end, what became the criteria of this was forced to be an on-prem resource?
Yeah. So really only one thing. So Crafty's business required video editing. We were creating 2 and sometimes 3 or 4 hour high definition, instructor led videos, and nonlinear editing is not a great workload for the cloud. Transcoding and encoding and things like that are ideal, and we used cloud resources for that. We used a partner for encoding.com, and then eventually Amazon's Elastic Transcoder. But the actual act of people doing video editing and some of the NLE tools, you just couldn't do that in the cloud. And we actually tried. We tried to do pushing remote desktops and all kinds of stuff, and it was none of it was anywhere near as efficient as an on-prem SAN with fiber wired into every video editor's desktop. So that was the right decision. I've never really questioned whether we should have tried to make that fit in the cloud, because it was such an important part of our business, and it's just massively more fast, reliable, and everything with having it on-prem. But other than that, everything else we did was either SaaS. I mean, certainly there's plenty of SaaS of applications that we use, but everything else we built out entirely in the cloud.
Nice. Okay. And we have a lot of listeners that we tend to get at a lot of newer listeners, but also a lot of listeners starting out. And if you would combine kind of the over the years as well as a little bit of that, put on the future hat for a second, how would you recommend folks get started in this space, whether it's tools to go research or ideas or cultural principles? What is your kind of base recommendations to somebody new these days?
Yeah, that's I think that the things that I blog about in my work with VictorOps and that I try to tell everybody who asks a question like that, start small and adopt as a first principle that your DevOps practice or your cloud practice is going to be iterative. There's going to be a lot of failures. There's going to be a lot of opportunity to blame that you're not going to do. You don't get to blame. And find a way that makes sense for your team to adopt some new practice or some new tool. And we could talk a lot about this, whether you do a skunkworks or just carve off a project to try and be more DevOpsy or more cloudy. Whatever you're going to start with, start small and expect to iterate on it. Don't create some huge goal to be completely adopted of some new tool or some new practice in 6 months. It's okay to have a goal and you should have one to work towards, but on the ground, it's every week, every iteration we're spending is continuously improving the process and the practice of what we're doing. And I think it's frequent that teams or people kind of get wrapped up in, if we just start using this tool, then we're DevOps, or, if we, make this cloud choice, then our infrastructure is better. And that's partly true. But if you aren't focused on the getting better every iteration part of it, you're not really sort of fundamentally changing the way your team operates. And so that's sort of like I said, that's a first principle. If you're going to get into any of this, is continuous improvement, which sort of requires, in incident management language, blameless postmortems, and in agile language, blameless and objective retros. You got to kind of take your soul out every now and then and look at it and make sure what you're doing is working. And if it isn't, be okay with changing it, and having sort of reasonable expectations to iterate into getting better over a long time frame. I think the other thing I might counsel people to be thoughtful of is, try and find something that's nearby your team's stack or is adjacent to your culture or existing tools. Maybe it's your existing tools you're just going to make better. I think a lot of times people who are just starting out, or even people who have been on this journey for a while, will go to a conference or listen to a webinar or a podcast, and who's presenting as a unicorn. And unicorn, either because they've invested so much engineering effort into what they're talking about that they've really unlocked something transformational, or unicorn because they have unlimited growth and funding and they can make all kinds of crazy choices and it doesn't really matter. And those kind of things can be really inspirational. But then you come back to the office and you try to fit the pattern of 10 deployments a day onto your actual, we're getting code out once every 2 weeks. And the gap is just too massive and people can be frustrated and sort of walk away from it. So, I think if you can find resources, or people within your network or even just adjacent technologies that are easier for you to see your way into will make that a lot better. Hopefully that made sense. But those are the things that I try to have people.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And kind of some comments on that too. If you can almost just extrapolate this idea of minimum viable product and iterate
yes,
just into so many different areas of life. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. There is the concept of, hardware products. There's the concept of software products. There's the concept of running a startup this way. There's a concept of, doing releases this way. This can apply to so many different things. And along those lines, it's no secret I work for a decently large infrastructure vendor now, and we generate a lot of content internally, and it's funny with, coming from a startup that has been acquired by a larger company, there are so many times when we, being, my old company, we still think that way and we still develop, anything that way, a document, a PowerPoint, the next release of our code, the next anything. There's been this shift over the last couple of years of workflow of any project really going on this, let's do the, minimum viable project and iterate on it over time as well, so that it isn't all this wasted time of in between something that maybe is off the mark or misses or needs to pivot, or it's really fascinating to see that idea as a whole just be embraced across our entire industry.
No, and I think it's going to, it's already become transformational for the industry, Aaron, and it's been so exciting, for me personally to have gotten to witness this, and having worked with startups most of my career, this has just seemed like the default way of doing things. Is we don't have the time or the resources to really plan this out. Let's kind of get an idea out there and see if it works. Which is antithetical at really big scale and really big teams. But the fact that they're able to adopt that, I think, is just that. It's making teams better. It's making products better. And it's exciting to see. It really is.
Yeah. So we're kind of running out of time here. I'll ask you one last question and we'll kind of wrap it up. What made you ultimately decide to leave your role at Craftsy and kind of hang out your own signpost, if you will?
Yeah, no, it's a fun answer. I have kids. My kids are almost 7 and 4. And as you can guess, the life of a startup technologist is super exciting, but it doesn't allow an awful lot of time and flexibility for taekwondo and basketball and things like that. And so first and foremost, I wanted to be able to spend more time with the family. And I've really had a lot of fun. I volunteer in my children's schools. We just launched a Sphero, a STEM program at my son's elementary. A Sphero, these little robots that you can program. Totally fun, and you should check those out. So I wanted to make just a lifestyle choice that gave me more time to do things like that. But, the second part is I kind of, in all humility, reflect on the experience that I was able to acquire at Craftsy, having built an entire business and stack in these both these ways, via DevOps and these tools via cloud, and realize that I think it can be, pretty useful to a lot of teams that are trying to figure this stuff out. So that's sort of what I'm experimenting with right now, is how useful can I be to teams who are trying to move forward either with a DevOps practice or a cloud strategy or an incident management practice, and honestly, in a way, give back in the way that I think I didn't do a great job of when I was with Craftsy, and share some of these ideas and processes with a wider audience.
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic. Great. Well, and so we will quick plug Dryas.io, DRYAS.io, and links will be in the show notes as well. Matthew, other than that, where else can other folks kind of follow you, find out what's going on, and reach out to you if they want to ask you more questions? Yeah,
sure. So I'm my name everywhere on LinkedIn, at Matthew Beckman on Twitter. A lot of the content that I'm writing right now is with VictorOps on their blog. I'd really encourage you to check that out if incident management is something that's interesting to you, and how you guys manage, how anybody manages on-call and alerting. So I got a lot of content there. I'd love to have side conversations with folks all the time. So ping me and see if I can be helpful to you.
Fantastic. All right. So Matthew, on behalf of Brian, who will be back next week, I'll edit that out as well. So let me start over there. So Matthew, on behalf of Brian, who will be back next week, thank you very much for your time this week. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.